I've been a truck driver for over a decade. Most nights, I enjoy the quiet solitude of the road. There's something calming about driving under a blanket of stars, the hum of the truck engine lulling me into a peaceful rhythm. But every trucker has stories of eerie nights, and mine began on a chilly October evening, the kind where the air smells of rain and the trees whisper in the wind. I had a late-night delivery to make to a small town about 4 hours away. The job was simple: pick up a load of goods from the distribution center and deliver them by morning. I'd done this run plenty of times, but something about this night felt different. I couldn't shake the uneasiness that clung to the air, but I chalked it up to the change in season and the early darkness that October brings. The first couple of hours went smoothly. The highways were mostly empty, and the low hum of the radio kept me company. I pulled into a rest stop halfway through the trip. It was one of those small, out-of-the-way stops that only truckers and long-haul drivers know about. There were a few other trucks parked, their drivers probably asleep, but the place felt deserted. I parked, grabbed my thermos, and stepped out to stretch my legs. The air was cold, and the sky was overcast, hiding the stars. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees that bordered the rest stop. I took a deep breath and sipped my coffee, but something about the place made me uneasy. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, and the quiet wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. As I stood there, I noticed movement near the edge of the parking lot. A figure was walking out from the tree line, heading straight for me. My heart started to race. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his clothes dirty and torn, as if he'd been out there for days. He looked lost, but there was something off about him, something that set off alarms in my head. "Can you help me?" the man asked, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken in a while. "My car broke down. It's just down the road, and I need a ride." I hesitated, unsure. There was no car in sight, and he didn't look like someone who had just broken down. Everything about him screamed danger, but I didn't want to leave him stranded if he was telling the truth. "Where's your car?" I asked, keeping my distance. "Just a little way down the road, past the trees," he said, glancing nervously behind him as if he expected someone or something to appear. I didn't like this. My gut was telling me to get back in the truck and leave, but I couldn't ignore the man's plea. "I can't take you, but I'll call someone for you," I offered, hoping that would be enough. The man's face changed. His expression twisted into something darker, more desperate. "You don't understand. You have to help me. They're coming for me." His voice grew frantic, and he stepped closer. My instincts kicked in, and I took a step back, fumbling for my phone. "I'll call the cops. Just wait here," I said, but the man shook his head violently. "There's no time," he shouted. "They're already here." Before I could react, I heard rustling from the trees, louder and closer than before. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away, eyes darting between the man and the woods. Something was coming, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. Without another word, I turned and ran back to my truck. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands shook as I fumbled to start the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting the man to be right behind me, but he was gone. The parking lot was empty, and the trees stood still, as if nothing had happened. I hit the gas and sped out of the rest stop, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, even though the road ahead was empty. The silence inside the cab was deafening, and I turned up the radio, hoping the music would drown out the fear gnawing at my mind. As the miles passed, I started to calm down. Maybe the guy was just crazy, a drifter lost in the woods. But the way he had looked at me, the fear in his voice, it didn't seem like the ramblings of a madman. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. They're already here. Who was they, and what were they coming for? I reached the small town just after midnight. The streets were quiet, and most of the houses were dark, save for a few porch lights glowing faintly. I pulled into the lot of the warehouse where I was supposed to make the delivery. The place looked run down, with faded paint and broken windows. It didn't seem like anyone had been here in years. I climbed out of the truck, my breath visible in the cold night air. The warehouse loomed in front of me, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. I grabbed the paperwork from the cab and walked towards the door. feeling uneasy. The silence was oppressive, and the wind had died down completely. It was as if the world had stopped. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. After a moment I tried the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was stale and musty, and the dim emergency lights flickered overhead. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. Something was very wrong. I walked deeper into the warehouse, my footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The loading dock where I was supposed to drop off the goods was empty, no workers in sight. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. This place felt abandoned, but I had just spoken to the dispatcher earlier that night. Someone was supposed to be here. As I moved further into the building, I heard a noise, a faint shuffling sound coming from somewhere in the back. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks, listening. The sound grew louder, like footsteps moving slowly towards me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I turned, ready to leave, but then I saw something move in the shadows. A figure stood at the far end of the warehouse, just out of the light. It was too far to see clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. But before I could make a move, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into complete darkness. Panic surged through me. I pulled out my phone, using the screen as a makeshift flashlight. The faint glow barely illuminated the space around me, but I could hear the shuffling getting closer, the footsteps heavier now. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the concrete floor. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, like whoever or whatever was chasing me was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get to the truck. I burst through the warehouse doors and sprinted towards my rig. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my hands shook as I fumbled for the keys. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, closing in. I slammed the door shut, locking it just as something hit the side of the truck with a loud bang. I screamed and threw the truck into gear, speeding out of the lot. The tires screeched as I peeled away, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in the side mirror, and for a split second, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I screamed and threw the truck into gear, speeding out of the lot. The tires screeched as I peeled away, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in the side mirror, and for a split second, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. My name is Dan, and I've been driving trucks across this country for over 15 years. Most of my trips are long and lonely, but I've never minded. I enjoy the peace that comes with the open road, the hum of the engine beneath me, and the stars twinkling above. There's something calming about it all, as if the world is quieter and simpler when you're behind the wheel of a big rig. But one night, everything changed. A routine drive turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It started with a job like any other. I was to pick up a load from a small town called Woodville and haul it to a warehouse about 8 hours away. The pay was good, and I had done the trip before, so I didn't think much of it when I got the call. The only catch? The delivery had to be made overnight. That wasn't unusual for me either. I'd done plenty of midnight runs before. Less traffic, less hassle. But that night, the moment I left the pickup yard, a sense of dread settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the weather. October always had that chilly, unsettling vibe. The trees on the highway were bare, and the winds howled through the woods like they had something to say. But nothing could have prepared me for what was ahead. I left the yard just after 10 p.m. The highway was empty, as expected, and I figured I'd get to my destination with time to spare. The road stretched out before me like a dark ribbon, flanked by trees that swayed in the wind. The radio was my only companion, playing softly in the background, though I kept the volume low to focus on the drive. An hour into the trip, I passed through a small town called Briar Ridge. It was one of those places you could blink and miss, just a few houses and a gas station. The road signs barely gave you time to read them before you were out of the town. But as I drove through, something caught my eye. There was a figure standing at the side of the road, just beyond the last streetlight. It was a man, tall, thin, dressed in a long coat. At first, I thought he was just a hitchhiker, but something about him felt off. He didn't have his thumb out, and he wasn't looking at the road. Instead, he was staring directly at my truck. I tried not to make too much of it. Maybe he was just lost, waiting for someone to pick him up. But the further I drove, the more uneasy I felt. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the man fading into the distance, but he was gone. It was as if he had vanished the moment I passed him. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. Long nights on the road could do that to you, especially with the way shadows played tricks on the mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned the radio up a notch, hoping the music would drown out the creeping fear building inside me. For the next hour, the road was silent again. Just me, the trees, and the occasional gust of wind that rattled my windows. I had almost convinced myself that the man by the road was nothing to worry about when I saw something else, a flash of movement in the trees beside the highway. It was quick, just a glimpse of something darting between the trunks, but it was enough to make me grip the steering wheel tighter. I slowed the truck down, squinting into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had seen. There wasn't much light on this stretch of road, just the headlights from my rig cutting through the night. But I swore I saw something, or someone, moving in the shadows. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal. The woods were full of them this time of year. But when I looked again, there was nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking, but the road ahead was empty. I pressed on, picking up speed again, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that was gnawing at me. I had driven this route dozens of times, but something felt different tonight. It felt wrong. 2 hours into the drive, I decided to pull over at a rest stop. It was one of those small, rundown places that truckers knew well. A couple of vending machines, a bathroom that probably hadn't been cleaned in years, and a row of parking spots for trucks. There was no one else there, just my rig and the dark woods surrounding the lot. I killed the engine and sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the wind howl outside. The trees rustled, their branches scraping against one another like skeletal fingers. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I forced myself to get out of the truck. I needed to stretch my legs, maybe grab a coffee from the vending machine. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I heard something, footsteps. They were faint at first, just a soft crunching sound coming from the edge of the parking lot. I turned, my heart pounding, but I didn't see anyone. The rest stop was empty. I told myself it was just the wind, that the noise was nothing. But as I walked toward the vending machine, the footsteps grew louder. They were deliberate, heavy, and they were coming closer. I stopped in my tracks, every hair on my body standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Anyone there?" There was no answer, just the sound of the wind and the creaking trees. I backed up, slowly making my way back to the truck, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I scrambled back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. The truck roared to life, and I pulled out of the lot as fast as I could. My heart was still racing, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the lot, watching me drive away. But the road behind me was empty. I tried to focus on the drive, but my mind kept drifting back to the rest stop, to the figure I had seen by the road earlier, and to the flashes of movement in the trees. Something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. About an hour later, I saw headlights in the distance, a car coming up fast behind me. It was unusual to see anyone else on this road so late, but I figured it was another trucker or maybe a night shift worker heading home. The car closed the distance quickly, and I moved over to let it pass. But instead of overtaking me, the car slowed down, matching my speed. I glanced out the window, but the car's headlights were so bright that I couldn't see inside. I could only make out the dark shape of the vehicle, a black sedan. I frowned, my grip tightening on the wheel. This was odd behavior, and it was making me nervous. I slowed down, hoping the car would pass me, but it stayed right beside me, its headlights blinding in my side mirror. I rolled down the window slightly, trying to get a better look, but the car suddenly sped up, roaring ahead of me before swerving back into my lane. My heart skipped a beat as I slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. The car sped off into the night, its taillights disappearing around a bend in the road. I sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. What the hell was that about? It felt like someone was playing a sick game, trying to scare me off the road. But who? And why? Shaking my head, I continued driving, my nerves on edge. The rest of the night was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there, watching me from the darkness. The closer I got to the warehouse, the more isolated the road became. The trees seemed to press in on both sides, their twisted branches forming dark, menacing shapes against the night sky. Every so often I thought I saw movement in the woods, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I arrived at the warehouse. It was an old, decrepit building at the edge of a forgotten industrial park. The windows were dark, and the place looked abandoned, but this was where my delivery instructions had led me. I parked the truck and climbed out, the cold air biting at my skin. The place was eerily quiet, and I couldn't see any lights on inside the building. I double-checked the address, but there was no mistake. This was the right spot. I approached the loading dock, knocking on the metal door. My knuckles echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. The building felt dead, like no one had been here in years. I was about to give up and head back to the truck when I heard a noise behind me, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. I turned, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The lot was empty, the shadows long and still. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the doorway was empty, just a dark void leading into the building. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to get back in the truck and leave, but I had a job to do, and I couldn't afford to lose the pay. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside, the door clanging shut behind me. The air inside the warehouse was cold and musty, and the place smelled like it had been abandoned for years. My footsteps echoed in the large empty space as I made my way through the building, looking for someone, anyone, to sign for the delivery. But there was no one there. The place was deserted. I was about to head back to the truck when I heard it again, the scraping sound. This time it was closer, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. I froze, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" No response. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. It sounded like something, or someone, was dragging themselves across the floor, slowly but deliberately. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of there, but before I could move, the lights in the warehouse flickered and went out, plunging the building into total darkness. My name is Roy Henderson. I've been a long-haul trucker for 20 years, and I've seen just about everything. Flat tires in the middle of nowhere, sleepless nights on dark highways, and even the occasional wild animal trying to cross the road in front of my rig. I've been through it all, and nothing has ever really scared me. That is, until last year. I was taking a load from Nevada to a small town in northern Idaho. It wasn't supposed to be anything unusual, a regular run, nothing complicated. I picked up the cargo, frozen food bound for a grocery store chain, and hit the road around 8 p.m. I prefer driving at night when the roads are emptier and the air is cool. The quiet of the open road was comforting to me. It was late October, and the chill in the air felt more intense as the night went on. Driving through the desert, with the mountains far in the distance, I had plenty of time to think. But as I moved deeper into Idaho, the landscape started to change. The flat, barren desert gave way to dense forests and hills. The winding roads began to close in on me as the trees grew taller and thicker. I had been driving for about 6 hours when I noticed something odd. My GPS had been acting up, which wasn't that unusual in these remote areas, but this time it kept rerouting me to a road I didn't recognize, Route 66B. I'd driven this path before and had never come across Route 66B. At first, I ignored it, sticking to the highway I knew, but the GPS insisted. After about 20 miles, the GPS started glitching even more, and I was losing cell reception. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the map I had on the passenger seat. But when I came to a T-junction, the sign for Route 66B appeared out of nowhere. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to take the turn. Maybe it was my exhaustion. Maybe it was some strange force pulling me. I turned onto the narrow road. The moment I turned, something felt wrong. The trees on either side seemed to close in like a tunnel, and the air felt heavier, like there was something watching me. My headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled over the road. I slowed down to a crawl, gripping the steering wheel tighter as I squinted into the dark. My truck's headlights cast long, eerie shadows through the trees, making it hard to tell what was real and what was just a trick of the light. There were no other cars, no lights, no signs of life anywhere. It felt like I had left the world behind, entered some strange forgotten place. I checked the clock on the dashboard. It was 2:30 a.m., but it felt like time had slowed down. The road stretched on endlessly, winding deeper into the woods, and my sense of direction was completely gone. I should have been near a town by now, but all I could see was the dark, twisting road ahead of me. After what felt like hours of driving, I noticed a faint light in the distance. It flickered through the fog, weak and uneven. I slowed down, relieved to see any sign of civilization. As I got closer, the light took shape, a small, run-down gas station on the side of the road. The building was old, with peeling paint and a rusty sign that was barely readable. I station's lot, stopping beside the single pump. The place looked deserted. No cars, no people, just the faint glow of a single bulb above the door. I killed the engine, taking a deep breath. My heart was pounding, and I wasn't sure why. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air hitting me like a wall. The silence was overwhelming. I walked up to the door of the gas station, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it swung open with a creak. Inside, the place looked as old and abandoned as the outside. The shelves were mostly empty, and the counter was covered in dust. A faint buzzing sound came from an ancient refrigerator in the corner, but otherwise, it was dead silent. Behind the counter stood a man. He was tall, thin, and wore an old flannel shirt and a trucker cap that looked as worn out as the rest of the place. His eyes were shadowed beneath the brim of his cap, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. He didn't say anything as I walked in, just watched me with a kind of unsettling stillness. I'm looking for directions," I said, trying to sound casual. "My GPS is acting up, and I'm a little lost." The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at me for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're on Route 66B, aren't you?" I nodded. "Yeah, I didn't mean to take it. I'm trying to get back to the main highway." The man's expression didn't change, but there was something about the way he looked at me that sent a chill down my spine. He reached under the counter and pulled out a map, an old faded one that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "You won't find this road on any modern maps," he said, laying the paper out in front of me. "Route 66B isn't like other roads. It doesn't go where you want it." I frowned, leaning in to look at the map. It showed the main highway, but Route 66B was just a faint line, barely noticeable. It seemed to twist and turn through the woods, leading off into nowhere. "What do you mean?" I asked. The man looked up at me, his eyes dark and serious. "This road, it doesn't follow the rules. People who take it don't always come back." I stared at him, unsure if he was trying to mess with me, or if he really believed what he was saying. "That's a little hard to believe," I said with a nervous chuckle. He didn't smile. "It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. You're on the road now, and the only way off is to follow it to the end." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I looked at the map again, my heart racing. "Is there another way? Can I turn back?" The man shook his head. "Once you're on 66B, you don't turn back. You drive until it lets you go." The silence hung between us, heavy and oppressive. I didn't know what to say, and the man wasn't offering any more advice. Finally, I nodded and thanked him, feeling more uneasy than before. I left the gas station, climbing back into the truck. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man watching me from the doorway. But when I looked back, The gas station was gone. I blinked, gripping the steering wheel tight. The building had disappeared into the fog as if it had never been there. My stomach twisted with fear, but I forced myself to focus. I had to get off this road. I kept driving, but the further I went, the stranger things became. The fog grew thicker, swirling around the truck like a living thing. The trees on either side of the road seemed to shift and change, their branches reaching out like claws. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the fog, a shadow, a figure, something darting between the trees. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. Time felt like it was slipping away. The clock on the dashboard seemed frozen, and no matter how long I drove, the road never seemed to end. It just kept winding, twisting deeper into the woods. At some point, I noticed something else. The cargo in the back of my truck, the frozen food, was starting to thaw. I could hear water dripping from the trailer, and the air inside the cab felt warmer than it should have. I checked the temperature gauge, but it showed everything was normal. Still, the feeling of warmth persisted, and the smell of rotting food began to fill the truck. I pulled over to the side of the road, stepping out to check the trailer. The fog was thicker than ever, and the silence was suffocating. As I walked to the back of the truck, I noticed the doors were slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't opened the doors since I left the loading dock. How could they be open now? I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open, expecting to see boxes of thawed food. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The trailer was empty. Not a single box remained. The entire load had disappeared, leaving nothing but a dark, gaping void inside the trailer. I backed away, my mind racing. How was this possible? I had been hauling the cargo the whole time. There was no way someone could have taken it without me noticing. The fog pressed in around me, and the air felt thick and heavy. I had to get out of there. I jumped back into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. But as I drove, the road seemed to shift beneath me. The trees closed in, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck like fingernails on a chalkboard. The fog grew thicker, and the headlights barely pierced the darkness ahead. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it, an old wooden bridge up ahead, stretching across a narrow ravine. The wood looked rotten and unstable, and my gut told me not to trust it. But the road didn't offer any other options. I had no choice. I slowed down, inching the truck onto the bridge, the wood creaking under the weight of the rig. Every second felt like an eternity as I crawled forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog swirled around the truck, and the sound of the creaking wood was deafening. Halfway across the bridge, the truck jolted, and I heard a loud crack beneath me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck coming to a stop. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel, waiting for the bridge to collapse. But it didn't. The truck stayed in place, teetering on the edge of the bridge. I held my breath, afraid to move. Then I saw something in the fog. A figure, standing on the other side of the bridge, barely visible through the swirling mist. It was tall and thin, with long, bony arms that hung down at its sides. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, staring straight at me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I floored the gas, the truck lurching forward. The bridge groaned beneath the weight, and I felt it start to give way, but I didn't stop. I pushed the truck as fast as it would go, racing toward the other side. The truck hit solid ground just as the bridge collapsed behind me, the wooden planks splintering and crashing into the ravine below. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove for what felt like hours, the road winding and twisting through the endless fog. But eventually, the fog began to lift, and the trees thinned out. The road straightened, and the oppressive weight in the air seemed to fade. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 6. Somehow, I had made it through the night. I don't know what Route 66B was, or what I saw on that road, All I know is that I'll never take that route again. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. And some things are better left unseen. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years. I've seen just about everything out there on the road. Terrible weather, strange people, wild animals darting in front of my rig in the middle of the night. But none of those things prepared me for what happened one October night on Route 42. What I saw out there on that highway haunts me to this day. It started like any other long haul. I had picked up a load of groceries from a distribution center in Minnesota and was heading west, making my way through the Midwest. My delivery was in a small rural town in Montana. I had a good 15 hours of driving ahead of me, but that was no problem. I've done plenty of long hauls before, and I actually enjoyed the quiet solitude of driving at night. The truck I was driving was an old Peterbilt, a reliable workhorse that had seen its fair share of miles. It was getting on in years, but it had never let me down. That night, the engine purred like a kitten as I cruised along the empty highway. The sun had set hours ago, and the road was dark, lit only by the glow of my headlights and the occasional flicker of lightning in the distance. I could tell a storm was brewing, but I figured I'd be able to outrun it. As the night wore on, the road grew even more desolate. I hadn't passed another vehicle in what felt like hours, and the only sign of civilization was the occasional farmhouse way off in the distance. It was the kind of night where the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever with no end in sight. I turned up the radio to keep myself awake, but after a while the stations faded into static. That's when I saw it, the sign for Route 42. I had driven through this part of the country plenty of times, but I had never noticed Route 42 before. The sign looked old, weathered by time and the elements. The road itself was barely visible, just a narrow 2-lane strip of asphalt that disappeared into the thick woods. Something about it made me uneasy, but I checked my map, and sure enough, Route 42 was a legitimate shortcut that would save me about an hour on my trip. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the dark, winding road. Then I shrugged. An hour was an hour, and I wanted to make good time. I turned off the main highway and onto Route 42. At first, the road wasn't too bad. It was quiet and empty, just like the highway I had been on. But the further I drove, the more things started to feel off. The road became narrower, the trees on either side closing in like dark looming walls. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had suddenly rolled in, and the air grew colder, biting at my skin even through the closed windows. I told myself it was just the weather. I'd driven through plenty of fog before, but then I noticed something else. My GPS had stopped working. The screen showed nothing but a blank white void. I fiddled with it for a minute, but no matter what I did, the signal wouldn't come back. I checked my phone, but it had no service either. I should have turned back then. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around, to get back on the main highway. But I was stubborn. I was a professional driver after all. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a busted GPS spook me. So I kept driving. The road twisted and turned through the dense woods, the trees forming an almost tunnel-like canopy overhead. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows at the edge of the road, just a flash of movement, quick and fleeting. It was probably just animals, I told myself, deer or raccoons or something, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like something was watching me, keeping pace with the truck just out of sight. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The old Peterbilt rumbled steadily beneath me, but even the familiar hum of the engine couldn't calm my nerves. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees and fog closing in tighter with every mile. Then, out of nowhere, the fog thickened even more, reducing my visibility to almost nothing. I had to slow down to a crawl, my headlights barely illuminating the road ahead. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. Something wasn't right. That's when I saw her. A figure appeared in the road ahead, standing still in the middle of my lane. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the figure, illuminated by my headlights. It was a woman, at least I think it was. She was dressed in a long white gown that fluttered in the wind, even though there was no breeze. Her hair was long and dark, hanging down over her face, obscuring her features. She didn't move. She just stood there, her head slightly tilted, as if she was staring at me through the windshield. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my fingers ached. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go around her. The road was too narrow, and the trees were too close. I couldn't back up either, not with the fog as thick as it was. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there, me in my truck, her in the middle of the road. Then, slowly, she started to move. She didn't walk, she glided, like she was floating just above the ground. She moved toward the truck, her head still tilted, her hair hanging over her face. Panic surged through me. I slammed the truck into reverse and floored the gas, but the old rig lurched and sputtered. The engine died, and the headlights flickered off, plunging me into complete darkness. I fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the truck, but my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip them. The woman, if that's what she was, kept coming closer, her pale form barely visible through the fog. Finally, the engine roared back to life, and the headlights blazed on. But when I looked up, she was gone. I sat there for a moment, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined her? Had it all been some kind of hallucination brought on by the fog and the stress of the drive? I didn't wait to find out. I threw the truck into gear and floored the gas, speeding down the narrow road as fast as I could. The trees blurred past, and the fog whipped around the truck like some living thing, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. After what felt like hours, the fog finally began to lift. The road widened, the trees thinned, and I could see the stars overhead again. I checked the GPS, and to my relief, it had started working again. According to the screen, I was only a few miles away from the nearest town. I pulled into the town around dawn. It was a small place, just a few houses, a diner, and a gas station. I parked the truck at the diner and stumbled inside, still shaking from the night's events. The waitress behind the counter gave me a concerned look as I sat down. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee. "You could say that," I muttered, taking a sip. The coffee was hot and bitter, but it helped steady my nerves. "You must have taken Route 42, she said, glancing out the window. "We don't get many drivers coming through that way anymore." I frowned. "Why not?" The waitress hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer, her voice low. "There's something wrong with that road. People say it's haunted." I stared at her, my heart skipping a beat. "Haunted?" She nodded. "They say a woman died on that road years ago. Her car broke down, and she was walking for help when a truck hit her. The driver didn't stop. Ever since then, people who drive that road at night have seen her. They say she tries to stop them, just like she tried to stop the truck that killed her." A chill ran down my spine. "What happens if you stop?" The waitress shrugged. "No one knows. Most people don't stop, they just keep driving." I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Had I really seen the ghost of the woman who died on Route 42? Or was it just a trick of the fog and my tired mind? I finished my coffee, thanked the waitress, and headed back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw her again, standing at the edge of the parking lot, her white gown billowing in the wind, her dark hair hanging over her face. But when I blinked, she was gone. I didn't take Route 42 again on my way back. In fact, I never drove that road again. There are some places that aren't meant to be traveled, some things that are better left unseen, and some ghosts that never stop haunting. My name is Jack, and I've been driving trucks for over 20 years. Long hauls, lonely nights, endless highways, that's been my life for as long as I can remember. I never thought much of the long hours or the isolation. After all, it's just me, the road, and my rig. But something happened last October that made me question everything. It started like any other drive. I'd been assigned a route that took me through the back roads of West Virginia, delivering machinery parts to a small town called Kingston. I wasn't looking forward to it. The roads were narrow and winding, with dense woods on either side, and most of the area didn't have cell service. But a job's a job, and I didn't have a choice. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. The sun was setting, casting a fiery glow across the horizon as I passed small towns and gas stations. Soon the sky turned dark, and the only light came from my truck's headlights cutting through the inky blackness. I turned on the radio, hoping to catch a late-night talk show or some music, but all I got was static. No surprise there, given how far out I was. Sighing, I focused on the road ahead, trying to ignore the eerie quietness that surrounded me. As the hours ticked by, I found myself driving deeper into the forest. The trees were thick, their branches hanging low over the road like skeletal arms reaching out. I had the strange feeling that I was being watched, though I knew that was impossible. The only things out here were animals, or so I thought. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. A thick fog began to roll in, heavy and dense. It wasn't the normal kind of fog you see in the early morning hours. This was different. It seemed to cling to the road, swallowing everything in its path. My headlights barely pierced through it, and I had to slow down just to see a few feet ahead. "This is just great," I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The last thing I needed was to end up in a ditch in the middle of nowhere. The fog grew thicker as I pressed on, and soon, I could barely see the road at all. My heart pounded in my chest, and I began to wonder if I should pull over and wait it out. But before I could make a decision, something darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a halt. The fog swirled around me as I sat there, trying to catch my breath. Had I imagined it? It was hard to tell, but I could have sworn I saw something, a figure maybe running through the mist. I waited for a few moments, listening to the sound of my engine idling in the eerie silence. Nothing. No movement, no sound, just the oppressive weight of the fog. "Get a grip, Jack," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But as I started to ease my foot off the brake, something else happened. A faint tap, like fingers on glass, echoed from the passenger side window. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned my head, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. But there was nothing, just the fog. I stared at the window for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the tapping to come again. When it didn't, I let out a shaky breath and put the truck back in gear. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I drove for another hour, the fog never letting up. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows darting between the trees, fleeting shapes in the mist. But whenever I looked directly at them, they were gone. By the time I reached a small gas station, I was on edge. The place was old, run down, with a single flickering light above the pumps. It didn't look inviting, but I needed a break. My hands were shaking, and my head was pounding from the stress of driving through the fog. I parked my truck and climbed out, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The station was deserted, but the door to the small convenience store was open, and I could see a faint light inside. I hesitated for a moment before heading toward it. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I was greeted by the smell of stale coffee and dust. The store was as old and forgotten as the rest of the place. Shelves were half empty, and a small radio played static in the corner. Behind the counter sat an old man, his eyes glazed over as he stared at a newspaper in front of him. He didn't look up as I approached. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. "Fill her up." The old man didn't respond. He just kept staring at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, leaning over the counter a bit. Still no response. It was like he hadn't even heard me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was off about this place, about him. I glanced around the store, noticing for the first time how still everything was. No hum from the refrigerators, no creak from the old floorboards, just silence, heavy and oppressive. "I'll just pump it myself," I mumbled, backing away from the counter. I hurried outside and started filling up the truck, my eyes scanning the fog-covered road. The mist seemed thicker now, almost alive as it swirled around the gas station. I could barely see the edge of the forest anymore, and that same sense of being watched crept back into my mind. Once the tank was full, I wasted no time getting back into my truck. As I started the engine, I glanced at the gas station one last time. The old man was standing in the doorway now, watching me with those blank, glazed-over eyes. A shiver ran through me, and I quickly drove away. Once upon a time in a small, quiet town, there lived a 12-year-old boy named Jake. He was a typical kid, enjoying video games, skateboarding, and hanging out with friends. But he had one big fear: being home alone. The idea of being in the house by himself, especially at night, made his heart race. One Friday afternoon, Jake's parents announced they would be going to visit his grandparents for the weekend. They would leave right after lunch and wouldn't be back until Sunday evening. Jake felt a mix of excitement and dread. He loved the idea of having the house to himself, but he also remembered all the scary stories he had heard about being home alone. "Just remember to lock all the doors, Jake," his mom said as she packed her bag, "and don't open the door for anyone, even if they say they're friends." "Okay, Mom," Jake replied, trying to sound brave. He watched his parents leave, waving goodbye as they drove away. The house felt quiet, and the silence was both thrilling and terrifying. After a couple of hours of video games, Jake decided to explore the house. He walked from room to room, checking all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The big old house creaked and groaned, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer as the sun began to set. As night fell, Jake decided to make some popcorn and watch a movie. He picked a horror film, thinking it would be fun to scare himself a little. As he settled down on the couch, the eerie music and flickering images on the screen sent chills down his spine. Halfway through the movie, he heard a loud bang coming from the basement. It echoed through the house, making his heart race. "What was that?" he whispered to himself. He paused the movie, straining to listen. The house was silent again. Taking a deep breath, Jake decided to investigate. His parents had always warned him about the basement, saying it was full of old junk and probably some creepy things too. But curiosity pulled him in. Grabbing a flashlight, he walked toward the basement door. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he slowly descended into the darkness. The air felt cold, and Jake shivered. He pointed his flashlight around, illuminating dusty boxes and old furniture. The basement was exactly how he remembered, cluttered and dark. Just as he was about to turn back, he saw something move in the corner of his eye. He whipped around, shining the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. "It's just my imagination," he told himself, trying to shake off the fear. Suddenly he heard it again, a soft whisper. "Jake, come here." The voice was faint, but it sent a shiver down his spine. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. He took a step back, feeling an urge to run, but he couldn't make himself move. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Jake, don't leave." The air grew colder, and he felt a chill run through him. The shadows seemed to grow darker, and he could feel something lurking just beyond the light of his flashlight. In a panic, Jake turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. He leaned against it, his heart pounding. "What was that?" he gasped, trying to catch his breath. He could still hear the whispering in his mind, and he felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He tried to distract himself with the movie, but he couldn't focus. Every creak of the house made him jump. Eventually, he decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would chase away the shadows. But as he lay in bed, the whispers returned, echoing in his mind. "Jake, come back." The first night, Jake tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The darkness of his room felt suffocating, and he could hear the wind howling outside. He decided to get up and check the doors again. Maybe if he made sure everything was locked, he would feel safer. As he walked through the house, he felt like he was being watched. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift and move, and he could hear the old house groaning as it settled. He checked the front and back doors, ensuring they were locked, then returned to his room. He pulled the blanket over his head, trying to block out the fear. But sleep didn't come. Instead, he heard the soft sound of whispering again. "Jake, don't be afraid." "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice breaking the silence. The house grew quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Hours passed, and finally exhaustion took over. Jake fell into a restless sleep, filled with nightmares of shadows and whispers. When he woke up, it was still dark outside, but he felt a strange sense of calm. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the house was still. Jake decided to get a drink of water. As he walked to the kitchen, he heard a loud thud from the basement again. This time, it was closer, and his heart raced. He paused, debating whether to check again. The whispers returned, soft yet urgent. "Jake, come to me." He took a deep breath, summoning all his courage. He tiptoed to the basement door, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The darkness seemed to pull him in, but he stepped down the creaking stairs, flashlight in hand. As he reached the bottom, he felt the temperature drop. The air was thick, almost suffocating. He shined the flashlight around, illuminating the old boxes and cobwebs. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer, just silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Jake felt a cold breeze rush past him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Panic flooded him, and he turned to run back up the stairs. But as he reached the door, it slammed shut in front of him. "Let me out," he shouted, banging on the door. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him. "Jake, you can't escape." Jake's heart raced as he struggled against the door. He pushed with all his strength, and finally, it flew open. He stumbled out and slammed it shut behind him, gasping for breath. He ran to his room and locked the door, his mind racing. What was happening? Was it all in his head, or was something really in the house with him? The second night the next day, Jake tried to act normal. He played video games and watched TV, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every noise made him jump, and the whispers continued to haunt him. He even tried to call his parents, but they didn't answer. That evening, as the sun set and shadows crept into the house, Jake felt the fear returning. He knew he should stay busy, but the thoughts of the basement kept creeping into his mind. Finally, he decided to take a shower, hoping the hot water would calm him down. After the shower, he felt a bit better, but as he dried off and got dressed, he heard the loud bang again. This time it was accompanied by a low growl that sent chills down his spine. He froze, heart racing, feeling paralyzed by fear. He looked out the window, hoping to see a neighbor or someone passing by. But the street was empty, and the darkness outside felt heavy. He turned away, feeling like the walls were closing in. He grabbed his phone and texted a friend, but there was no response. "Great," he muttered to himself, feeling utterly alone. That night, he tried to sleep again, but sleep wouldn't come. The whispers returned, echoing through his mind. "Jake, you belong here." "Stop it," he yelled, sitting up in bed. The room was dark, and the shadows seemed to loom larger. He grabbed the baseball bat from under his bed, holding it tightly. Hours passed, and he finally drifted into a restless sleep. When he woke up, the sun was shining, and he felt a bit of relief. He went to the kitchen for breakfast, trying to shake off the night's events. But as he poured cereal, he heard a noise behind him. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway and the light streaming in through the windows. Jake decided he needed to get out of the house. He grabbed his skateboard and went outside, hoping some fresh air would help clear his mind. He rode around the neighborhood, but no matter how far he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him at home. When he returned, he felt a sense of dread wash over him. The house was quiet, and as he stepped inside, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The third night that evening, Jake felt more on edge than ever. He made dinner, but every noise made him jump. After he ate, he decided to call a friend. This time, his friend answered. "Hey Jake, what's up?" his friend asked, sounding cheerful. "Not much, just hanging out at home." "You busy?" Jake tried to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, I'm over at Alex's place." "Why? You should come." Jake hesitated. "I can't. My parents are out of town." "Dude, you're home alone? That's awesome." "Not really," Jake muttered. "I keep hearing weird noises." "Like what?" "Just noises. In the basement. Whispers." "Sounds like you're just scaring yourself," his friend laughed. "Yeah, maybe," Jake replied, but he didn't feel convinced. They chatted for a bit longer, but Jake eventually hung up, feeling more anxious than before. As night fell, he locked the doors and settled down to watch a movie, trying to distract himself. But the movie didn't hold his attention. He was too aware of every little sound. The whispers seemed to grow louder, echoing in his mind. Just as he was about to give up and go to bed, the lights flickered again, and the power went out. Darkness enveloped the room, and his heart raced. "Not again," he whispered. He grabbed his flashlight and moved cautiously through the house. The whispers returned, swirling around him. "Jake, you can't hide." Panic surged within him. He ran to the basement door, feeling drawn to it despite his fear. As he opened it, the air grew cold, and the whispers intensified. "Join us, Jake." "No," he shouted, slamming the door shut again. He turned and ran back to his room, locking the door behind him. He sat on his bed, clutching the baseball bat, breathing heavily. Hours passed, and eventually, exhaustion took over again. He fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of shadows and whispers. When he woke up, the sun was shining through his window, but he felt more exhausted than ever. The confrontation the next day, Jake decided he needed to face his fears. He couldn't keep living like this. He gathered all his courage and made a plan. He would confront whatever was in the basement once and for all. That night, he prepared himself. He grabbed his flashlight and the baseball bat, telling himself he could do this. As he stood at the top of the basement stairs, he took a deep breath. "I'm not afraid," he whispered to himself. He slowly descended into the darkness, the flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The air was colder than before, and he felt a sense of dread wash over him. But he pressed on, determined to find the source of the whispers. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty space. "I'm not afraid of you." The whispers grew louder, swirling around him. "Jake, you belong to us." "I don't belong to anyone," he yelled, swinging the bat in the air. He felt foolish, but also empowered. Suddenly, the figure appeared in the shadows. It was dark and twisted, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through him. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice low and menacing. Jake felt fear grip him, but he stood his ground. "Leave me alone," he shouted, raising the bat. "I won't let you take me." The figure lunged forward, and in that moment, Jake swung the bat with all his strength. It connected, and the figure let out a shriek that filled the basement. A rush of cold air surrounded him, and he felt the shadows begin to unravel. With a final swing, Jake felt a release, as if a weight had been lifted. The figure dissolved into darkness, and the whispers faded away. He stood in the basement, panting but relieved. A new day, Jake climbed the stairs and emerged into the light of his home, feeling different. The air felt lighter, and he could finally breathe. He had faced his fear, and won. The next day, his parents returned home. They were happy to see him, and Jake shared his experience. They listened intently, and his mom hugged him tightly. "You're so brave, Jake," she said. "We're proud of you." From that day on, Jake felt changed. He learned that fear could be confronted, and he was no longer afraid of being home alone. He even kept the baseball bat in his room as a reminder of his courage. As time went on, he shared his story with friends, inspiring them to face their own fears. The whispers never returned, and the shadows in his house felt less menacing. Jake embraced the light in his life, knowing he had the strength to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. Jake had discovered that true courage comes from facing your fears, and he knew he would always remember that lesson. The darkness was no longer something to be feared, but rather something to understand and conquer. He looked forward to all the adventures life had in store for him, ready to embrace each moment with confidence.